Let's get ready to build your first application with TMS Miletus. Before you continue, make sure that TMS Miletus is correctly set up on your system. I'm going to show you these steps so you know you're ready to go. Also, I'm going to use Apple macOS to demonstrate this. All you need to follow is the terminal, or iTerm in this case, and a text editor. As there is no good text editor coming out of the box with macOS, in my opinion, I'm going to use UltraEdit. You may also use Visual Studio Code or the text editor that comes with your Apple system. It doesn't really matter. All you need is a text editor and the terminal. In order to find out if Miletus has been installed correctly, simply type Miletus on tab, and it should be auto-completed to MiletusPackager. If that already does not work, the installation did not complete successfully, because MiletusPackager, the command, needs to be available in your path. Then using the option -H should show you all the possible commands for MiletusPackager. MiletusPackager is launched with a path that includes all the files for your web application. The easiest way to achieve this is to create a new directory and then store all those files in one directory that belong to one application. I've already created a directory called Hello World, and if we look into the directory, it's empty. And the bare minimum that you need in order to have an application is one HTML file that you should name index.html and the Miletus control or configuration JSON file that is mentioned in the calling options of the MiletusPackager. So let's create both of them. You find all the necessary steps to create this first application also in the documentation in the section called Your First Application. This also contains the index.html file that we're going to use and the configuration file that we're going to use. Miletus makes it very easy to get started. Even though that you could copy-paste the files from the documentation, there's an easier way to get started. Simply call the MiletusPackager and use the init parameter. It will ask you for the application name, in this case, Hello World, and for the main HTML file. If you don't specify a value, it'll use index.html, which is exactly what we want. So we press enter again, and if you look at the directory now, all the files for a basic Miletus application have been created. We can now open them in a text editor and make the additions that we need. Let's have a look at the index.html file that was created. It creates all the basic elements of one page, of your index page. The HTML doc type, and then the two HTML tags to encompass the document, the header, and the body. So changing the title, we can say this is a Hello World app. And then in the body, we can type a paragraph, Hello World. And that's it. This will show the text Hello World. The next step is to look at the configuration file. First of all, the configuration file is a JSON document, which you surely know as a web developer. And the JSON consists of one object, so to speak, with multiple properties that configure your application. The name of the application is specified in the name property, and then you can specify the files that belong to your application. More so, the main entry point of your application is this HTML document. And then you need to list all the files that need to be included in your application. In this case, only the index.html. Be aware you can use subfolders and you can use wildcards to include whole subfolders, for example. In order to have the bare minimum configuration file, you also need to add the target property. It contains an array with strings that determine the target platforms that you want to use. In this case, I'm going to create a Windows 64-bit executable, and this is possible. Even though I'm using Miletus on the Mac, I can still produce a 64-bit binary for Windows. In addition, however, I also want to produce a Mac ARM 64-bit executable, and that's how easy you add more platforms. You can remove and add as many platforms as you wish. And if you wonder, where do you find all the possible constants for all the different platforms, or what are even the platforms, well, again, the documentation helps you there. If you go to the section called Packager Configuration, you not only find a complete configuration files with all the possible options, you also find a complete description for each of the properties, listing all the possible property values. For target, you find the list of all the possible platforms that are possible. Windows 32-bit, Windows 64-bit, Linux 64-bit, macOS 64-bit on Intel platform, and Mac 64-bit on the ARM, or as Apple calls it, M1, M2, and so on. Also possible is the Raspberry Pi. Be certain that this last letter is an L, it is not a 1. Let's also add the Linux 64-bit, Act64, and this easy. You add more platforms to your app. And this is how easy it is to prepare your web application to be deployed as a desktop application to the targets that you specify in the configuration file. At this point, we switch to the terminal. If we list the directory again with LL, you should see the 2 files we just created. And now all you need to do is call the MiletusPackager. And if you are in the directory that contains these files, you can just use period as the placeholder for the current directory. Press enter, and all the binaries will be created in lightning speed. And again, to emphasize, I'm on a Mac system, but I still created binaries for Windows and for Linux. Let's look at them. I'll use the macOS Finder to show the directory structure as a tree. So here are 2 files that we created, the index.html and the configuration file. We end up with subdirectories for each of the targets that we specified. For example, here is the Windows 64-bit executable. It's 1 executable and 0 library dependencies. On my Mac, if I double click here, it will launch inside of my virtual machine because I've set up my Mac like that. So if I double click here, immediately my virtual machine wants to start this, so I can say run. And there is my Hello World, Miletus application created on the Mac, executed on Windows. And this works just as easy for the ARM target, for example. This is an M1 Ultra processor that I use. I double click on Hello World, and here is my Hello World application in macOS. Same application, of course, it's just a text message, it's nothing fancy. However, there's more samples available, so you can get a first-hand impression how powerful Miletus really is. Finally, looking into the Linux folder, there are the Linux binaries that I would be able to copy onto a Linux virtual machine or onto a Linux system and execute right there. So this is how easy it is to create desktop applications from your web applications with TMS Miletus.